All right. Well, hello and welcome to the Arts Lunch at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. I'm Jennifer Oz Freeman, and I'm Associate Professor and Program Director for Theology and the Arts here at United. And in today's Arts Lunch, I'm going to share a little bit about icons and about, in particular, a recent workshop that I took on painting icons with the Prosophone School. So I'm going to say a little bit about the origins and theology of icons, but I'm like second guessing that. I was like, I shouldn't have put anything in the slides about that because I could just talk the whole time on those two things and never get to the icons themselves. So I'll try to kind of go quickly through that part. And if you have any questions, I could always circle back to that part, I guess. So we'll start here, the question about the origins of icons. Is something that is, like many art forms and traditions, complex, and there's not just one origin, of course. And when we're talking about icons, I suppose the first thing to say is that the English word icon comes from the Greek word icon, which is cognate basically, and in its most basic sense in the Greek just means image. So for example, in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the translation of Genesis 1:26, talking about humans being made in the image and likeness of God, the word image there was translated icon in Greek, right? So it's just image. Now, there's a whole nother debate, of course, like what does it even mean to be made in the image of God? But we don't have time to talk about that. So we're just going to talk about art history. So over time, and as an art historical term, an icon basically means like a holy portrait. It's often panel painting, painted on a wooden panel, and often with egg tempera, but not exclusively, and as a sacred image, as a kind of sacred portrait. An icon can be in any material. It can be a textile, it can be mosaics, it could be whatever. It's more the kind of certain criteria, I suppose, and the way that the image is engaged with. So for already getting ahead of myself. So origin of icons, why do I have images of the Roman catacombs up? Because this is one place we can point to for an association between images and presence, an idea of presence. And so on the right-hand side, you see the kind of basic structure of what a lot of the catacombs look like, which is basically a shelving unit for bodies. And these were often plastered up or covered in different ways. And often, as you see on the left-hand side, might have portraits of the deceased, might have in the Christian catacomb, might have images of Jesus, especially Jesus performing miracles. But the vast majority of images in the Christian catacombs of like the 3rd and 4th century were primarily from the Hebrew Bible, were primarily stories like, there's not one in here of like, for example, the 3 youths in the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or of Jonah and the sea creature. So these stories that have to do with salvation, covenant, and often have baptismal references, like in the example with Jonah. This image here is of the 3 magi coming to Mary and baby Jesus. So you have the depositing of bodies and often a portrait or an inscription nearby. And for the early Christian community, especially for those special friends of God, the martyrs, they were even more likely to have their grave sites visited, right? Maybe on the anniversary of their death or something like that. And maybe even leaving or displaying wreaths or burning a candle or oil lamp or having a meal. Those things were kind of frowned upon by early Christian leaders as being too pagan. And eventually over time, it becomes very well accepted by the Christian church when the paganism is no longer viewed as being an immediate kind of influence or threat. So bodily remains and portraits there. image and presence. Yeah, I tried to make notes to myself of what to say. We don't have, so there's early Christian images from the late 2nd, early 3rd century, what we might call an icon, and the way that we think of that now, which is usually a non-narrative image, kind of like frontal-facing portrait. There are sometimes narrative, there are narrative icons sometimes, but this is the type I think that we think of. So this is a 6th century icon, and it's maybe not quite 2 feet high. This was just at the African Byzantium exhibit at the Met in New York City, which I went to see and was incredible. It's an encaustic painting on wood, and the encaustic means that that is wax mixed with pigment, and it basically, you know, before oil painting is invented, kind of has a similar effect where the light can enter the wax and creates a kind of warmth, I think, you know, the kind of luminosity that you get with oil painting. We don't have very many panels like this that survive from before the so-called iconoclastic controversy, and we definitely don't have time to talk about that, but I'll just say one of the reasons this is significant is that it's an early example. And this type, oh, here's a nice detail from that I took in the exhibit. You can get a sense of it's just really nice texture. And you can work with encaustic either hot, like melted wax, or in a cooler state where you kind of are working with a putty knife, basically. And I've only minimally done it. I don't think I could. But the kind of prototype, maybe for this type of painting, is in this group of paintings known as the Fayum funerary portraits in Egypt, which are a kind of this hybrid moment, basically, between Roman art and Egyptian art. So you have, as you can see on the bottom left image, this portrait of the deceased person has been applied directly to their wrapped body. So basically, it would be also an encaustic on a piece of wood board and just of the deceased person's face, and then applied directly to their wrapped remains. So this is like, these group of paintings are kind of 1st, 2nd century CE, and they're some of my absolute favorite paintings in the whole wide world. They have really, they're very, I don't know how you call them, like they're empathetic, they're very personal, they're very kind of individual, they're just like many of them, I mean, they vary in quality. Some of them are really gorgeously rendered. And they sometimes too will have, you know, so they have this kind of like modeling, you know, dimensionality, but then also sometimes application of gold leaf in a very 2-dimensional kind of graphic way. And there's something interesting that happens with that too, I think. So you have this already as an art form, again, association between portraiture and presence, bodily presence. And that's something that gets increasingly associated with Christian portraiture. And I guess to talk more about it, you'll just have to take the art history class, because I can't go into the whole thing, but part of it has to do with the rise of Islam in the rise and success of Islam in the late 6th, early 7th century, and gradually the Byzantine Empire is, you know, 2/3 of its land becomes occupied and run by Islamic forces. And so so now see, I'm starting to talk about it. I said I wasn't going to. Anyway, images start to become more powerful in this time, is the short answer. And it's all complicated, but I'm going to say it in a very basic way, because we should move on to talk about icon painting and what I did. So I don't want to talk the whole time about this. If you have any questions, let me know. It's much more complicated, but we'll say we end up with something called icons. There's something called the iconoclastic controversy, what more or less gets attended to through 2 ecumenical councils. The second one's in 843, and this leads to celebrated as the triumph of orthodoxy. It's an affirmation of the use of icons in liturgy and in the devotional life of the church. And in fact, to this day, we still celebrate the triumph of orthodoxy in the Orthodox Church with a procession, the beginning of Lent, isn't it? So in the fall, what I'm going to share about and show you kind of step-by-step process, I took While on my sabbatical, I took an intensive 1-week class with the Prosopone School, which is based in New York City, but they offer these courses all around the country and sometimes internationally in a variety of contexts. Mine was Monday through Friday, and also a little bit on the previous and following Sunday and Saturday. The format was that we gathered every morning for a very short kind of prayer, iconographer's prayer, and then we listened to a lecture by the main teacher, Vladislav Andreev, and he's Russian. He came to the US several decades ago, and he would give the lecture in Russian, and then his son, Deacon Nikita, would translate it into English, and so they'd kind of go back and forth, and it was really nice to just hear a lot of Russian. Oh, here they are. So it was at St. Mary's Orthodox Church in Northeast Minneapolis. And you can see Vladislav here is doing a demonstration, and then Nikita is explaining things. And basically there were about 30 people in the class. I think there were maybe a dozen of us who were first-time folks, and then the rest were doing a more advanced icon. So they tend to start you with the archangels. So we started with Archangel Gabriel. Before I show you my examples, I'll say some of the kind of key things. It's hard to boil down all of the theology of the icon, and especially what we learned in this week, is they're very informed by mystical theology, like Pseudo-Dionysius, and also I think in that way are influenced by Neoplatonism too. But what is the role of the icon? It's really important, of course, in the liturgy. If you've been in Orthodox Church, you'll know that the whole church is usually covered in images in the front of the church, up in the apse and all around, and that these images are doing a lot of theological and liturgical kind of heavy lifting and presenting a kind of interpretation of salvation history. Icon is first and foremost an incarnational statement. It's an affirmation of the incarnation in the iconoclastic, so-called iconoclastic period. The pro-image folks basically argued that because God became flesh in the person of Jesus, it was necessarily imageable. And so that therefore it wasn't just permissible to make images of Jesus, it was necessary. It was a theological imperative to make images of Jesus, and to deny such images was to functionally deny the reality of the incarnation, and therefore be heretical. So it's an affirmation of the incarnation. They're very relational. Like I said, they're in frontal facing portraits. They can be full body, but usually kind of bust portrait. And so as you view an icon, there are large wall, like mural icons, but most of them are smaller panel paintings. So they have a kind of visual intimacy, right? It affirms the goodness of matter. This is related to the incarnation, but that material is good. Material can convey the holy, right? Material can, and holiness is kind of catching, I think, contagious. All humans are made in the image of God, and all humans are therefore icons of God by that principle. And you see that, for example, in the Orthodox funeral liturgy, where people are invited to come up and venerate the body of the deceased person, because that person was an icon, right? The way we would venerate painted icons. For an iconographer in particular, the Prosopone School talks about icons as painted prayer. And so the act of painting, and it has these 20 different steps that their school kind of structures, invites the artist into self-reflection. And so because there's like a theological meaning ascribed to every step of the icon painting process, the artist is then like invited to think of how are they reflecting the image of God? Are these things lining up, so to speak? Mostly I'll say it was really difficult, and I did a lot of breathing, tried to breathe slowly so as to make nice lines with my brush. And then again, on a more theological point, these are in no particular order. Or incarnational is definitely at the top, but the rest are kind of jumbled. The icon participates in the prototype. This is another statement that came out of the iconoclastic controversy. Well, not came out of, it's actually from the 4th century, from Basil of Caesarea, in this treatise he has on the Trinity, but it gets plucked out of Basil and it gets used by pro-image folks in how they're talking about images. So he wasn't actually talking about icons in that text, but is to say that when you venerate or honor an image, say of the Virgin Mary, you're not venerating the wood or the paint of the icon, but that honor passes on to the prototype in some way. I can say more about that too. The image on the right-hand side is, as you can see in the label, a 12th century icon of a 7th century text called the Ladder of Divine Ascent. And I shared that because the icon painting process is described as having rungs likewise. So this is a kind of mystical, ascetical text that has 30 rungs described of ascent. The icon painting process, according to the Prosophone School anyway, has about 20 rungs. For the purpose of our class, which was about 40 hours of painting and instruction, a lot of those stages were compressed. So you see, we weren't able to do all 20 separate steps. But you'll see in my labels, I should have gone through these photos from the class immediately and like labeled them well, because going back, it became difficult to like kind of figure out which step it was. And sometimes it was because we were combining steps. So that was just for the sake of time. Any questions so far before I go on? Okay. So the first thing is that the icon board itself has theological meaning, and it's talked about as the tree of life, and the grains of the board have a vertical orientation. Usually the board is made from a softer wood, and then often on the back of the board there will be 2 cross beams made from a harder wood, and those cross beams are actually inlaid into the wood of the board so as to prevent it from warping over time. You can see this is a very nice board that they gave us as part of our tuition, our supplies, and it's covered with gesso. So the first stage with a board, an icon board, is that you would apply with glue a piece of canvas, very smooth and very nice, applied to the board, and then a series of layers of gesso, which is a kind of chalky type paint, basically glue and a chalky material. And something like 9 to 12 layers of gesso need to be applied, each sanded very smooth between each layer. And the application of the gesso is really important because if it's not applied well and not sanded well, then as you paint, air bubbles will come up through the gesso and can interfere with your image. So it's really important to have a good foundation, and there's theological meaning for all of that, right? You can see not all icon boards are like this, but this is one format where there's this recession. So you basically have a raised border around the image, where the part where the image goes, and this recession is called the arc of the icon, or sometimes the temple. And it also works very nicely visually. So it has its own frame and reiterates this idea of interiority that you're invited into. There's a lot of language of both like ascent and deepening, which is common in mystical theologies, right? So just from a practical perspective, the way we transferred the image, and this is mostly for the sake of time for the class, and also because we were novices, and so you don't want to have people spending a week trying to draft an image and all this kind of thing. So we were doing Gabriel. They gave us basically this template here, and then carbon paper, and then you retrace the image to transfer the image with the carbon paper. So pretty straightforward there. Then the next step was the etching of the lines. For our purposes, also being novices, we just did really around the head and maybe around the outside. It kind of depends on the particular process you do, but you could etch in all of the lines. And basically that's using a sharp point to literally engrave, to etch in the surface of the gesso, and you want to have just enough so that some white powder starts coming up, and then this will help because you're going to paint a whole bunch of layers over this, and so you pretty much lose your image early on, so it's one way to kind of have a reference point. And then what you see around the halo and the border here is the application of what's called bowl, or it's basically a burnishing clay, also called red adam, and the part around the edge is just decorative. The part around where the halo is here is where the gold will be applied. And so so it's called red atom because this is creation. So there's a lot of like creation imagery that's applied to the icon painting process, like separation of light and dark and all these kinds of things. So you apply the bowl, you let it dry, and then it's ideal for it to be kind of cold. And then because the way that you apply the gold, which is our next step, is by breathing onto it. So you go like these long, big, hot breaths onto the clay. And then you take your gold leaf, and you can see down here, I have it on wax paper because gold leaf, if you've ever worked with it, and Max has, it's very, not even temperamental isn't the word. If you touch it, it will crumple up. I mean, it's very thin and prone to static. So they set it up for us basically that it was with wax paper, so it's easier to apply and cut into little strips. And so you breathe nice and long onto it, and this is the kind of enlivening of Adam, the enlivening of the clay, and then the application of the gold. And we apply the gold first because, one, for a practical reason, once you start painting around this, the gold would stick to the other kinds of paint and things like that. So you have to do it first. But also because gold is the only element that's not, and my other parentheses, gold is the only element that's not composite in the whole construction of the icon. And so it is the spiritual element. And so you start with this element. The thing I have on the right-hand side is a little video, which hopefully will play. And it's actually, I've started an icon on my own since this class. So it's not the same icon. You see it's facing the other way because they're going to be buddies. This one's Michael. So you can see a little bit of the process, and you'll be able to hear Tom Waits playing in the background, I think. Let's see if he goes. There we go. So, and then you take a brush and you brush away the excess. So you want to be, it's like $75 for a pack of 25 little sheets of gold leaf. So you want to be careful with how you allot your gold leaf so that you get the most out of it. And then you would, I guess one thing I didn't say about the bowl layer is that, in this application, now having done it, I see like I should have done a whole nother layer on this one, but basically what you do is you sand and burnish. So you sand with two types of sandpaper in different grains. You want to get really, really smooth, and then you take a stone, usually an agate stone, and rub it back and forth. It needs to have a smooth side, but you rub it back and forth and burnish the bowl. So you can see over here, it's like very shiny because I've been going like that on the clay bowl, and that will help it be a good surface for the gold to attach to. And if you have any imperfections in it, the gold will reveal it. So you basically refurbish, burnish and refine as needed. Again, a kind of like theological connotation there, right?
Jennifer,
you have a good surface. Yeah.
Jennifer, I have a question.
Oh, sure.
Who gets to wear a halo? And I know the Trinity has a cross in their halo, but how are halos sorted out?
Sure. Well, in icons anyway, yeah, halos are used for saints and biblical figures. If you have a cross inscribed halo, there's different, that's almost always just for the second person of the Trinity, for Jesus. But yeah, there are icons where with the Trinity, sometimes they'll all have a cross inscribed halo. There are, in early Christianity, I'm trying to think of the first, there's an image of Jesus in the catacombs. It's like a later image, I think more like early 4th century, where he has a halo, and it's a cross inscribed halo and has an alpha and omega in it. But in the earliest Christian art, you don't have halos consistently. And I think there's something iconographically that come to Christianity by way of Greco-Roman art, which I think comes by way probably of maybe Buddhist art, maybe Egyptian art. Like you have some other, like a lot of religions have taught, associate light with illumination or spirit or things like that. So there's, I think, a mysterious lineage for where where halos come from in the Christian tradition,
Thanks.
that you can't draw a direct line from. But yeah, for who gets it, the other thing about, and this is true in Catholicism and Orthodoxy, where sometimes there's, you have these figures who've been saints for a long time, or kind of like no-brainers, like certain biblical characters and things like that. But a lot of the ways that saints become saints is from the ground up. It's from local practice and veneration. So, for example, just recently, and actually, I don't know that she's maybe technically a saint yet, but Mother Olga of Alaska in the Orthodox Church is kind of in the process of becoming a saint. But there have been icons of her for a while, and she's venerated as and I'm trying to think of the term that's used before saint, because I know in the Catholic Church it's like beatified or something like that, but there's another word which I'm blanking on. I'm sorry, but anyway, which is just to say that she was, she's been regarded as a saint by people in the Orthodox Church for quite a while, and is a contemporary person. So there's some instances like that where you'll see icons painted and people ascribed halos even before they're like officially, in the canon as saints. Does that kind of answer?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So you burnish, you apply this. You can see my first go is a little patchy. You usually do 2 layers of gold, which I ended up doing for that icon. And then you can also burnish the halo, but I was nervous about it, my quality of my application. So I didn't burnish it again because I was afraid of it coming up. When I get more confident, I'll do it. So there's that where you saw. And then the next step, which is the real first painting, is a red line around the halo, which you do with a compass. And it's a compass with a stylus in it so that you can put paint in the stylus instead of like the pencil end, you do a stylus end. So, and then I painted in the middle like that. And the red is for the blood of the martyrs, of course. I think that's what they said. I actually looked back in my notes and I couldn't find that reference, but I'm pretty sure they said blood of the martyrs. But yeah. But this is the first kind of painted thing. Oops, here we go. And then they don't always do the lines first. This again was some of the compressed process, but sometimes you'll do the first float of colors and then do the lines. We did the lines first. That was also pretty nerve-wracking. And basically with each step of painting this, because you don't really know what's coming next as the first time, I found myself like fussing over each, trying to get everything really right. And then we would do the next step and it would completely obliterate the previous step. And it's like, oh, why did I worry so much about what I was just doing? Which also feels like a good life lesson. It's like, maybe you don't like hyper focus on these certain aspects when like you don't know the next thing that's coming. So that was a really good learning experience for me. And I was, I've been wanting to take this class for literally like a decade and just was never able to do it. And so I had put kind of like a lot of pressure on myself and on the class, and I was also aware of that. So I was like, okay, I've been painting like pretty much my whole life. It's a very different kind of painting. So I was like trying to set myself up for like, this might be super stressful. It might go really poorly. I might not like the theology or, there's a whole range of things that I was trying to prepare myself for, disappointment. So it was, we were basically painting for 8 hours a day or 7 hours a day, and it really flew by. And it was in this big gymnasium with terrible lighting that was like buzzing. And I brought headphones to like listen to music, but once I started painting, I like didn't even notice anything about the environment. I never used any music or headphones. I just painted the whole time. So what we're seeing here is the first application of color, properly speaking. And the Proserpine school paints more or less according to like the Russian and Byzantine style, especially the Russian style, which is this floating technique. So you have to have the board laying on a flat surface. You can't have it like on an easel or anything like that, because it really is just what it sounds like. It's floating the color. And so you can kind of see this mottled kind of variation, and that's because it's just pools of very watery pigment. They mix the pigment for us, which is the benefit of the workshop, although I wish I had been taking notes on that as well, but it was like so much information. I was just trying to like work on the painting. So it's egg tempera, which means that they make a mixture from egg yolk, which I have now since started mixing myself, but you basically crack an egg and take out the yolk, wash it off, and then pierce the yolk to extract the center. So you don't want the membrane of it at all. And then mix that either with like a dry white wine or vodka. I guess the alcohol does a certain thing. And then you can keep that in your refrigerator for like a week. And then you'll mix it when you're mixing pigment, depending on what stage. So this is like raw powdered pigment, natural pigments. They don't use synthetic pigments. And then with water. So it's different proportions, basically, depending on how opaque. And so we start much more translucent and are building up these layers, often alternating between warm and cool. So we start here kind of like with the chaos of creation, right? And it again has that kind of Genesis creation association with it, where it's just starting in like chaos and darkness. And as the creation narrative lays out in the first book of Genesis, that there starts to be separation and form that's created through kind of these contrasts. This sunk here is this greenish olive-ish color that's applied for skin and hair. And then basically you do these floats for all the other areas in the background. And these colors were all thankfully dictated by the exercise. These are the first highlights, and this is also where some of my process starts to get a little muddy in my images. So here's highlights on the fabric and in the wings, and then we applied another float of color to the hair and to the skin that was more like yellow ochre-y kind of in color. Yeah, I don't know. This is maybe first highlights. This is where, yeah, things get a little shaky. I think my application of paint on the face, you can see how it's kind of streaky. And then I started to fuss on it. It was much better on the hand. And I started to have trouble with the face because I was like wanting to fix it before moving on to the next thing, which is like bad idea. One thing, yeah, I have this note here to myself. So you'll see these kind of like spiraling folds that are found in the fabric in several places. And that's common in Byzantine and Russian style paintings, where it is theologized as a kind of spiral. So it's a reference to this like ascent that happens through the icon. And so it's both a spiral, they talk about it as like both an ascent and a deepening, very much in that kind of like mystical language. And so what was interesting too is like, even though, you know, in my little group, everybody had the same image, we were receiving the same mixed pigments, you know, mixed paints from the teachers. Of course, we're applying them differently. And as we start making our highlights, people's icons start to look radically different, because basically it means you're looking at the garments and interpreting where light hits and what it looks like. So it starts to be more and more individualized. This one you see, so we're going from a green to like a pinkish, like red based. So it's these complementary colors, and that creates kind of tension as you're layering these contrasting colors from warm and cool and kind of complementary colors. Creates kind of vibrancy in it. This, yeah, I don't know about that either. This is pretty like, oh, I can see what I did. See, I got this one out of order because I had already done the face there. So that was my problem. So we're starting to layer this. The facets on the clothing refers to these like second and third highlights, and that's where we go from having these kind of like lighter washes to actually more geometric things. And they actually had an image, like a printed image of light going through a jewel, like a diamond, and the way that the facets of a diamond create geometric shapes of light that are projected. And so they recommended looking at that image for thinking of like how the shapes that the light is creating. And so it's not at all trying to naturalistic. Some of this is like, oh, sure, this is how a garment would behave, but then you're trying to think a little bit in like how light hits a surface, but you don't ever want it to be naturalistic. Like that's not the point of the icon. The icon is representing a spiritual reality. And in fact, sometimes they would advise, like as you're making a composition, to like intentionally distort or to intentionally make a highlight in a way that doesn't feel right, because that tension like brings a different focus or attention from the viewer. And you don't want it to look like so distorted it's distracting. And that's another like line, is like a person should be able to like kind of engage with the icon without picking apart its details or getting caught up in some aspect of it, right? So it shouldn't be distracting. Oh, one thing I was gonna say there too is like you maybe notice often in, these don't have any architectural elements, but in icons that have architecture in them, that there's often talk of it being a reverse perspective. So rather than the kind of linear perspective or this recession of space that's depicted in, say, for example, Renaissance images and post-Renaissance images that are very much trying to like replicate what it looks like to see something in space, and so on. Orthodox icons are kind of like trying to do the opposite thing. And this reversal of perspective basically implies that the viewer is the vanishing point. So rather than the vanishing point being in the image itself, it comes out to you, right? And so there's often this kind of like distortion of architecture. Okay. Starting with some details. So here and there's a lot going on, it's maybe hard to see, but highlights in the brocade and layers of these underwings, some highlights in the hair. It's like they put in some sun-in spray to get these highlights. This is where you can see I had some trouble with this face. So we're starting to add like, there's layers of like this pinkish color, then sometimes there would be like a yellow wash over everything, and then we'd go in with highlights. And I started to get a little fussy, and the problem was that I had also too much egg, or I was applying the paint too heavily. And so I don't know if you can tell in this image, but basically there's like paint started coming up on the cheek right there. And then of course I would try to fix it by adding more paint, and egg tempera doesn't behave like other paint because of the egg, because of the protein in the egg, and you really have to let it dry, enough basically. So I started to have some conflict as I was attempting to land the plane, and we're putting other washes over these areas. So here we're almost to the end. Now see, you can see where that piece came off there. So we're getting the attributes of this staff and this little globe, the angels, the name. We added these little kind of lightning bolt. Basically, it's the headband. It's not actually lightning bolts, but the back of the headband, which is kind of like dynamically flowing in the halo. And then the details of like the jewels on the brocade, and the instructions for that were that this should be joyous. They're like, just go to town with pearls on this thing. You really want it to feel kind of like joyous and like very like celebratory, kind of, which was not something that I had kind of thought of. So we're doing some highlights in there and so on. And then the last step is the life-giving lines, these final highlights that are primarily just white paint. And that you're thinking of a light source, you do have to pick early on kind of where's your light source coming from, and that's associated, of course, with the halo. And usually the last lines, or one of the last lines you do, is just the little bit of white around the eyes there. And this is the thing that kind of like enlivens, if you contrast, enlivens the image, so to speak. Yeah, I guess the other thing I'll say, and so some final highlights on the garment and things like that. And I was really stressed out about this face, because it's like the face is like the important part of the icon. Like it's like the whole point. It's like the most, it's the focus of the painting. It's like, it's the whole, the theology is very much tied up there. And so the teacher had advised me, Deacon Nikita had advised me the day before, and I had kind of tried to fix it, and I let it dry. And then the next day when I came in and applied the next float, this next wash of color, it came up again, and I brought my icon up to the front of the class, and I'm like, I don't know what to do. Like, I keep kind of messing this up, and it's like right on the worst spot, and I'm just like, anxious about it. And he said, maybe it's a miraculous icon. And because there's a famous icon of the Virgin Mary where she actually has a scar painted on her face. And it's one that's like, there are miracles attributed to this icon. So he said, maybe your icon is like this, and it has this, kind of blemish, and this is a miraculous icon. So that really, shows you how Orthodox I guess I am, because I was like, oh, whew. Like, it just gave me, it was like, okay, it's fine. Like, it doesn't have to be. And it's funny because my aesthetic, as you all know, like, normally is not very perfection oriented. Like, I'm generally not very concerned with having something be just so, but it was really stressing me out of this icon. So it gave me some relative peace with it. I don't have an image of what the final stage would be, which is covering it in oil. And this is both like an anointing, like blessing action, and also a way to seal the paint. So in fact, I have since damaged this icon a little bit because I brought it to show someone, and because it wasn't yet sealed, some of the paint has scratched. So I have to decide now, do I start futzing with the paint, or do I learn my lesson and just leave it as is, which is probably what I'll do, and not try to fix anything. But it's two different kinds of linseed oil that basically you heat up in like a double boiler, and pour on the icon very, very thick, and you basically rub it all over, and then just let it sit for like 3 or 4 hours. And once it starts setting, then you wipe off the excess. So it's just not too thick, just a fine layer to seal it. And then, if you're of my persuasion, you would take it to church and give it to the priest to bless. And then usually the priest will like leave it on the altar for a day or so, and then we'll bless it and give it to you. So that's kind of the whole liturgical conclusion of the painting of the icon. Here's my little station. You can see I'm like trying to test out my brush strokes and colors. And then here's the icon outside, and much different, better color than the kind of like fluorescent lights of the gymnasium where we were working. And the other thing was, it was almost Deacon Nikita's birthday when we had this class. And so his brother had bought him this guitar, who's also an iconographer, and then his father had painted the guitar for him. So this is all painted in tempera and then sealed. And so he didn't have an amp with, obviously he didn't know he was going to get this guitar, but he did sit down and play for us a little bit, and that was really cool. Kind of charming. In the gymnasium. And here, I should move towards concluding here. This is an icon I've started by myself at home. So my kind of Christmas/birthday treat to myself was buying my own set of pigments, and ordering a board through a reputable supplier, because again, it's that foundation, so you want to make sure it's prepared well. So I'm doing Archangel Michael to go with Gabriel, and so they'll be facing each other. And I've only done this kind of first process, and now I need to start doing the highlights. So it's my first time mixing egg tempera. I felt like the first phases were okay, but I don't know what the rest will be like, because it's when you start layering. Basically, I'm nervous about the face. I'm nervous to mess up the face again, and I think I just have to like do it. And after I got all the supplies, it took me like 2 weeks to even start the icon, because I was afraid of mixing the pigment. So here's a little detail. You can see working with natural pigments is really nice, actually. And so it is a little rough, and so I'll have to kind of not sand it, but kind of like lightly brush off the surface before doing the next painting, exactly because, especially with blues and greens, they are more granular, just in the pigment. And then here's some, I suppose maybe by way of conclusion, this is a little gesture towards the diversity of icons and iconographic traditions. And Vladislav, the founder of the Prosopon School, was talking about when he first founded the school, people in the United States, Orthodoxy is still a very small group in the United States. But in the 1980s or so, like people really didn't know about icons. Like there just wasn't awareness of much of icons as a art form, not much interest in it, and he's remarked that now there's like so much more awareness and kind of interest, and you have some people who are, as on the left, come out of the Orthodox tradition and are like reimagining icons. And there's a great show right now at the Museum of Russian Art, of a woman who is trained in iconography and now lives in the US, and is making these like kind of icons of nature, essentially. So she's using traditional methods, icon methods, but painting non-traditional icons, essentially. So anyway, I'll stop sharing so I can see you. If there's any questions or comments? That makes sense.
Thank you.
It's
Yeah.
really interesting.
Feel it.
I have a question. Oh,
Yeah. Word.
I was just wondering if you anticipated as a painter yourself going off in one of those directions. Do you want to do icons in a less orthodox way, like the three you just showed us?
Yeah. I don't, not for the foreseeable future. I think it will take me so long to get good at just doing any kind of facility with doing, I think for a first icon, it was fine. You learn, it's kind of like graduate school actually, where it's like, it's not until you finish graduate school that you really know how to do graduate school. So like, that was just my personal experience of graduate school, I'll say. Because you get through the whole thing, you're like, oh, that's what that was. Now I could start over and do it the right way or a different way.
Oh, could you tell us now? So
Yeah, what all the secrets are. I mean, I felt similarly about giving birth to children, where it was like, you have no way to conceptualize what it will be. There's some things where it's like, oh, I know, like intellectually, like I understand the basic mechanics of what that is. But it's not really until you like live through it that you're like, oh, that's what that meant. And I think graduate school is like, you understand in a basic sense what it is, or like writing a dissertation. It's like, yeah, I understand the parts of a dissertation, but it's not until you like write it yourself that you understand, what it is. And I think the painting the icon was very much like that. It's like, I've taught on Byzantine icons for years. I've taught this stuff and I had a basic sense of, oh, they go from like dark colors to lighter colors and like tempera and da-da-da. Like I knew all that stuff. But painting it was a radically different experience. And for me was like, very humbling as somebody who's experienced as a painter. Not that I think like I'm the best painter or anything, I'm not, and my color theory is always the thing I think needs work. But it was just like the confidence of the lines that you need, because you need to work egg tempera, you have to work quickly. And there's, the floats are really easy. That's nice to do. That feels good. But when you get into the highlights and these things that are more precise and more opaque, you have to work with a kind of speed and confidence that just there's no shortcut to that. It just takes a lot of practice and time. And I think that in fact, something I want to incorporate into these before I get to the highlights of this next icon is to just spend some time working on like watercolor paper or something like that, and kind of making some of these arcs and these kinds of lines that go thin, thick, thin, like the eyebrows and things like that, just for working on my technique, basically. Yeah. So I think also because it's a new practice to me, like I first got interested in icons like visually when I was in college, and I had no awareness or context of like what orthodoxy was. And I wasn't really interested in any of the historical context or current context, because I liked how funny they looked to me. And so I would use them like, for my own art making as like quirky inspiration. So I feel like in a way I've already done, like I had this series that I did of like Ronald McDonald in icons. And so I feel like I've already kind of done the non-traditional thing, and now I'm excited to do the traditional thing. Yeah. Elliot, what was your?
Yeah, I have a question. So really early in the presentation, you mentioned how when you were drawing or when you were like making the lines, your breathing was like really affected. And I found that very interesting because of the connection between breathing and prayer and just all the time. So I guess I'm wondering, like, knowing that the very process of making the icons was so affecting for your breathing and therefore scientifically to your state of mind.
Yes.
Do you think that did you go about the practice like thinking, I'm going to do this really prayerfully, or were you like, was it a side effect?
I think it's much more, it's true in all my life generally. Yeah, I think that it's more of a side effect because it's definitely true. Like, I mean, yeah. And so we say this prayer at the beginning. And anybody, anybody can take the classes. Like they don't ask anybody's religious tradition or anything like that, but they are very clear that if you sign up for the class, they expect you to come 15 minutes early to participate in the prayer. The idea is like, you're kind of agreeing to participate in what the school is, right? What the thing is, regardless of your context. So we start with that prayer, and which includes a singing of a hymn that I know like well, and so that was helpful. But I noticed the effect throughout the day. So like there were some times, and I had to work, especially in the first couple of days, to not like actually like actively curse under my breath when I made a mistake. And there was a couple times where I did a little bit, and I would just be like, okay, like breathe through it. And I would really just have to like slow down. Like I think there were some points, and also not even just like with the brushwork, but in identifying the shapes of highlights, I would sometimes sit down and too quickly jump into something and start making a shape. And I think there's like a balance, because on the one hand, you don't want to overthink it because then it becomes very labored. But on the other hand, if you jump into it unthinkingly, then you make a highlight somewhere where it doesn't make any sense. And I think, again, part of that is just, I have a lot of books about icons. And so I also want to kind of have them out and be looking at them so that you become familiar with some of the shapes and the ways that clothing appears and things like that, so that you kind of have this resource or database basically in your mind of like what the conventions are. Not that you copy them, because it also isn't right if you copy them exactly, it will look strange, but for the breathing, they talked about hesychism, which is this prayer approach to prayer in the 14th century. I don't know, not created by Gregory Palamas, but like really advocated. He advocated for it, which is like this embodied breath and a kind of like emptying, like self-emptying. And the word hesychism has different translations, but basically means like stillness or inner stillness. And it was controversial at the time because, or at least it was controversial in the West, because one of the premises was basically like, because of things like the incarnation and the goodness of creation, period, that we can know God through our bodies. Like we can know the divine through something like an embodied silent prayer, right? Through breathing. And that's obviously like a kind of mystical approach. So they actually talked about that a bit in the class. They didn't focus as much on the breathing part, but they talked about that kind of stillness and as part of the practice. And so I did find it's kind of like the like full flow idea, where it's like when you get into flow, like when you get focused, and as like somebody who has ADHD, I get it. I get that hyper focus situation. So it's like I could easily sit there if I'm doing something I like. I could do it for 8 hours without standing up, and like will often forget to like eat or go to the bathroom, unless somebody tells me to. And if I don't like what I'm doing, then I'll do a million other things to avoid doing that. So I did notice like by the end of the day, and I was like not on my email and not doing, these other kinds of things. It was like I was such a better person for that week. Like I was kinder to my family. I was like in a better mood. I was like, so it really did like it had a little rambly answer, but it definitely had an effect on me, like on my well-being. And that's why like this term, even as it's really busy, I bought those materials kind of like as a promise to myself that I would try to keep some of this practice with me, even when things are busy. There's a problem where it's like some of it's very time bound. It's like if you mix a pigment, that's only going to last so long. When you mix that egg mixture, you're gonna have to remix it in 7 days, so there's some of it. I can only do it sometimes if there's, depending on what stage, if I only have enough time, a big enough chunk of time, but I think it's been, really beneficial for me. And breathing for me has been I don't know if it's like, because I have asthma, but it's like much better now as an adult. But I think like breathing and prayer has always been like kind of closely associated for me. So it's, yeah, it makes sense that it's coming out in this like process. Anyway. Yeah, over answered that question. Any other questions? I have class in 3 minutes, but any other questions? Okay.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm curious, do you see a difference, not necessarily that they'd be mutually exclusive, but a difference between, say, being an artist and being an icon writer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think they're, like you said, they're not mutually exclusive. I think there may be like a Venn diagram relationship. I think there are aspects that are definitely shared. And I think some, in one way, like, you know, I'll always say a thing and then I disagree with it at the same time, but it's like, I think there's ways in which you'd say in their most basic level, maybe they're the same or they overlap just by like the nature of creativity and things like that kind of focus and flow and the way that that affects your breathing and your body and your wellness. And at the same time, and it's maybe, I suppose it depends highly on who's asking and who's answering that question. Because I think that they're, you know, in the class, they made reference to like a true icon. You know, I think I made this icon of Archangel. I think it's a fine first icon. I don't know that I would say it's a true icon. And a true icon doesn't necessarily have to be like the most beautiful or most well executed too, right? There are some that are much more like naive kind of painting or were painted at a time where an artist didn't have access to gold, or they were doing, you know, like there were, you know, these different limitations or things like that. And it can still convey something like that's pretty subjective. And there's the ideas of miraculous icons, all these kinds of things. So it's even a big question of like, what's a true icon and what is this kind of distinction? But just to answer it personally, I think like there are, the overlap for me is like when I think of, for example, Max, our collaboration, it's like just the act of making those images was really good for me just because I hadn't kind of accessed that practice for a while, like being creative and being playful. And so I think there's a spiritual component to that for me in a very basic sense. And some of it is like, you know, irreverently riffing on the very images and figures that both I study and are like in the tradition. And then the other piece is like from the specifically Orthodox side, there is something very distinct about icon painting or writing that, one, that it has these theological associations, but at their, you know, they'll detail all these layers and they'll describe them in detail and like interpret them in detail, but then also be like, don't worry about it. You know, the most important thing is that you relax into the presence of God. So it's like these steps are like a scaffolding, but if it is becoming like this burdensome, restrictive thing, that's not the point. You know, I mean, it's like many things about a liturgical life, right? It's like, if that becomes the focus, then you should not do it. You know, that's not the point, right? And it should be ultimately about, you know, being in the presence of God or serving other people or these kinds of things. So I did have a distinct kind of experience while working on the icons. And I think it challenges me in a distinct way that I have not been challenged in different types of art making. And so that for me is exciting to like encounter a new kind of both like material challenge in what I'm working with, and then also trying to enter into like a bigger tradition and think about that. Yeah. Thanks for the question. I'm sure I'll have a different answer later, but like that's my answer right now. Is like it's kind of the classic both and. Okay, I've got to run to class. Thanks everyone so much, and I'll see you all soon. Take care. Next month is Max's. So you're there in the room, but you could advertise that. I've got a